When our children are killing themselves rather than staying on the planet with us, we have a problem.
Mimi Nicklin, a globally renowned empathy expert, CEO, best-selling author and podcast host.
What is empathy? When do people use it? When do people not use it? What are the benefits?
Empathy is a skill set. It is a pro-evolutionary skill set. We're experiencing something called the empathy deficit. When there are low levels of empathy, the first thing you'll see is that the isms, racism, ageism, sexism, ableism, any of them go up.
Where does the empathy fit into that with people not behaving in the right way towards others?
Loneliness is not the lack of people, it's the lack of connection. 52% of us are lonely. That's half the world. 3.5 billion lonely people. The second biggest killer of our youth, 14 to 24-year-olds, is suicide.
What if you're the lonely person?
The only person that can fix your loneliness is you.
Business owners, listen up, because you are going to love today's episode, I am sure. Mimi Nicklin is in the house. She's a CEO, she's a keynote speaker, she's an author, she's a podcast host, and most importantly for today, she is an empathy expert. So I'm looking forward to digging deep. We've been talking a bit before we started recording, and I'm sure there's going to be loads of great angles, loads of great stories and interesting information. So Mimi, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute highlight. Honestly, I'm thrilled.
How are you enjoying being in Dubai?
It's hot. It's definitely hot.
It is very hot at the moment.
It is. You know, I always say that people say that New York is the city that never sleeps, but perhaps they've never been to Dubai, because it is just epically busy, isn't it? It's phenomenal. It's just bustling everywhere you go.
But I think I've been to New York a couple of times. I mean, like, I don't know it intimately, but for me, that's the city that never sleeps, but it's almost like aggressively not sleeping. Whereas, you know, Dubai is still a kind of a happy, friendly place.
Yeah.
Maybe an empathetic place.
Oh, that's debatable, but maybe it is. Yeah, it's definitely a different type of busy, but it's, I feel like there's just opportunity on every corner in this city. Wherever you go, someone has another opportunity. So it changes, right? It changes week to week. Phenomenal. It's a phenomenal place. It's been a great trip.
Love it. I mean, I came here accidentally. I was telling you just before we started, about 3 and a bit years ago now. Came for a week, 3.5 years later, still here. And I just can't imagine being anywhere else. I always say I do the PR for Dubai. So isn't
that the unpaid
exactly.
PR agent?
I am an ambassador.
Yeah, exactly.
Like an honorary Emirati.
Amazing.
So look, let's get in with the juice. What is empathy?
It's a good question. Fundamentally, empathy is about perspective taking. So empathy is the ability to stand in the shoes of someone else, to understand how someone else sees the world, is experiencing it, or has a perspective about it. So it's about being able to see beyond yourself and understand how the other people or person that you're with is seeing the same thing that you're seeing, but perhaps in a different way.
How's that different to sympathy?
Oh, it's very different, actually. So empathy is a skill set. Sympathy is an emotion.
Okay.
So empathy is built into your prefrontal cortex, Matt. We are born with the ability to empathize, unless you have a neurological reason to not have it. But so for 99% of the population, we are born with empathy. It's built into the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain. It is a pro-evolutionary skill set. It exists to help the human race survive.
But we may choose not to use it.
Exactly. You may choose to use it. I say that all the time on stage. You and I are like in tune. But yes, because it's a skill set, you can choose to use it. Whereas sympathy is an emotion. When you have empathized with someone, you can choose to sympathize. You can also choose to use that information differently. So empathy is a data set. It's about insight. It's about understanding how someone else is feeling or seeing things. Sympathy is feeling for them. Okay. Which is a very different thing, really.
And I mean, we're here talking primarily about business, but I mean, I guess, you know, the crossover from business and life is in everything. But I mean, just let's dig a bit deeper on empathy before we get into specific business situations. I mean, you know, when do people use it? When do people not use it? What are the benefits?
So in life, the benefits are endless. In fact, in business too. So often when I'm working with businesses, I say there is no data set that doesn't prove the benefits of having higher levels of empathy in the workplace. But in the world at large, we're experiencing something called the empathy deficit. That is the lack of empathy in our world. Now, when you understand and recognize that empathy is an evolutionary skill set, that we need it to not to thrive, Matt, to survive, the survival of the human race. We can't survive when we're alone. So when there are low levels of empathy, the first thing you'll see is that the isms, racism, ageism, sexism, ableism, any of them, go up. So low levels of empathy segregates our society. It pulls us apart. And when that happens, you see all kinds of gaps growing, bullying, segregation, isolation, all kinds of things. So it has a very negative impact, not least of which is an impact on our mental health. So today we have 400 million people with depression, right? We're carrying, as you probably speak to with your other guests, a mental health crisis out there in the world. Now, of course, that can't only be drawn directly to empathy, but our lack of connection is fueling that. And on top of that, we have a loneliness epidemic. So statistically, 52% of us are lonely. That's half the world, 3.5 billion lonely people. Now, when you recognize that loneliness is as dangerous to our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, we have a problem. This is one of the highest burdens on our healthcare all over the world.
And just on that depression and on that loneliness, I mean, I guess just so we can, benchmark it. I mean, what is the barometer for, classifying someone as depressed or classifying someone as loneliness? And, I'm always conscious of how I choose my words. And, I've had quite a few mental health experts on the show, and, whether that's people who are coaching others or people who've suffered it and come out of it themselves. But, one of the things I often talk about with it is how I feel it's overused as well. That, particular words like anxiety, and I never say it to take away, from the issues that people with genuine issues do have. But I also feel that, depression gets used as a word. You're not depressed, you're just pissed off. You've had a bad day, or, you don't have mental health issues. You're just a bit stressed. I mean, so in terms of being clinical and being an issue, I mean, what is the cutoff point, the barometer here?
So I'm not a mental health specialist to be able to tell you the specifics by country, but the data around the 400 million is coming from the World Health Organization, and they measure it differently in different countries, depending on the healthcare system within that country. One of the directors towards mental health, the mental health crisis that we're living in and these people, is the rate of suicide. So when I started this work, and I lived here in Dubai, I lived here for 4 years, and I wrote my first book here alone in 2019 and 2020. And when I discovered the empathy deficit, and I was at the very beginning of my journey with this, I found one statistic within this mental health space that really, stopped me in my tracks. And that is that the second biggest killer of our youth, 14 to 24-year-olds, is suicide. When our children are killing themselves rather than staying on the planet with us, we have a problem. And those are global data sets. Of course, those pieces of data change everywhere. But the impact on youth suicide, and in fact also across the board, suicide across the board, even in men, professional men, the statistics are huge now. We have problems depending on the country. Those levels change. But the crisis is being monitored and measured by the WHO, and that's where I take my data from in terms of those numbers.
Okay, so let's take that back to empathy.
What, the suicides?
Well, no, we were talking about its use and relevance in day-to-day life, and how you benefit, how we don't benefit, and you went on to talk about loneliness and depression. So where does the empathy fit into that with people not behaving in the right way towards others, or not not using this skill set that they've been given?
So as people, we need connection in order to function really well. So people often talk about the mind-body connection. When you are lonely, when you are feeling that you don't belong, when you feel that people don't see or hear you, you're not recognized, you are physiologically triggering your system, right? So from a mass social point of view, when you feel that you're alone, and perhaps you've experienced this, Matt, when you go to an event and you walk into a room, maybe a networking event, and you think, oh, I don't know if there's anyone here like me, or I'm not sure about this, right? Loneliness is not the lack of people, it's the lack of connection. And that connectivity is critical to all of us as human beings. When we feel disconnected, when we feel that we don't belong, when we feel lonely, it triggers something called the fight or flight response in the brain. That is an evolutionary ability for our bodies to protect ourselves, actually to stay alive, right? So when we were cavemen and women back in the day, and we lived in the jungle, and a saber-toothed tiger came out at us, our brains would register the threat, and it would change the way that your body works in order to either fight the tiger or flight it, run away. Because of that, what it would do is it would move the blood, the energy, the oxygen from the brain to the parts of the body that you need to flee or to fight, right? Legs, lungs, heart, all of those things. And therefore, move the energy or the blood away from the thinking parts of your brain, because you don't need to think when you're trying to survive, right? Now, the human brain is this amazing thing. In fact, there's data showing that our IQ as a nation, as a world, improves every 7 years. So the brain is always evolving. But the one thing that the brain still cannot do is recognize the difference between threats. So whether you are feeling anxious because there is a tiger, or because you've got a terrible boss, or because you're chronically lonely, or because you've been trying to date for 5 years unsuccessfully and you feel really alone, whatever that trigger is, the brain will respond in the same way. And when it moves that oxygen and energy out, it also produces hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, and puts them into the body. Now, those hormones are meant to help you. Anxiety is actually a really good thing. Anxiety is your body saying, there's a threat, hang on, you should review this, you should be careful, there's something risky, you've sensed it, you need to respond. But we're not meant to live with cortisol and adrenaline in our bodies for 12 months of the year. So that's why that connection to health is so, so critical. When we have a society that is disconnected, not only do they have lower immune systems, they're less able to fight disease. So we see higher levels of type 2 diabetes, high levels of cardiovascular health problems, inability to heal. So there's data that shows that 2 people with equal physiological risk from cancer, the person that is disconnected will heal slower than the person that is connected. So it's a huge impact on our life. On top of that, it creates things like bullying, gaps in society, issues in schools, violence, all kinds of social ills that rise when our connection as human beings decreases.
So when we talk about, let's say, developing empathy or using it, I mean, we say it's a skill, but is this something that people can really get better, or is it just, because like to me in simple terms, this sounds like, you just put yourself in someone else's shoes, you're just thoughtful, you imagine if you were in their situation. Now, whether or not, I guess you can still do what they want you to do, because you've got yourself to look after at that point as well, haven't you? But how do you develop skills in empathy?
So empathy is fundamentally about listening. So the backbone of empathy is just to listen. And listening seems like this really simple thing to do, especially if you're a podcast host. You're used to listening. You are practiced at listening, Matt. Every week of your life, you sit here and you listen. You know how to do that. But as a society at large, we've forgotten how.
And what are we
listen.
doing? What we're hearing, but not listening.
Exactly. See, you and I should go on stage. It's the second time you stole on my line today. Yes, exactly that.
But because we're too busy, because we're disinterested.
Because empathy has 2 great enemies, like kryptonite for empathy. One is low time, and the other is high stress. And if you ask all your listeners to pop their hand up wherever they're listening today, whether they have high stress and low time, they're all, most people are going to say, yes, me, right? Because to listen, you need time, right? What we do in our lives so often, we go, hi, how are you? I'm fine, thanks. How are you? That is not listening, right? That is not hearing each other. There is a very different line between those 2 things. So listening is an active skill. The difference is when you listen to understand versus listening to reply. And most of us are listening to reply most of the time, especially in the workplace, right? You sit in a meeting and your boss comes in and he says, we have to change the timeline. We're not going to be able to deliver. I told you it's August. Now it's got to be July. In your head, you're going, well, I'm going to have to tell him we can't do that. There's no way. The factory won't be able to, all those things, right? You are hearing him, but you're not listening because you're already formulating what you want to say when your gap comes. It's a little bit like when you go on an aeroplane, when you take off in the plane for not long, 15 seconds or so, you can hear that noise. But you don't sit there for 8 hours listening to that noise. You adapt. That's your hearing. It's a passive reality. Your body, unless you have a hearing issue, your body does that for you. It will monitor what you hear. Listening, you have to be active in. You actually have to show curiosity. You have to use questions. I teach a lot of neuroscience around how we use linguistics that enable people to connect and listen better. But it is an active skill set. And when I work with CEOs and leadership teams, the honest ones, they always come to me at the end and they say, Mimi, I had no idea. I've not been listening for years. to my business or to my wife normally. But they always come and tell me that. I had no idea that I wasn't listening.
Hey, Matt here, just interrupting myself quickly to say thank you for listening to No Bollocks. But did you also know I've got another podcast, Stripping Off with Matt Haycox? Very different. No Bollocks is the quick daily business tactics that you need. But Stripping Off, we go deep, deep, deep with a CEO, with a celebrity, with an athlete, with just an international, inspiring character. We find out what makes them tick, we find out how they got to where they got to, and we find out how you can learn and benefit from them too. So jump on over to Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, wherever you listen to your content, and I'll see you on a future episode.
And from a business perspective, and we'll dig deeper into that in a minute, but so you've been a CEO yourself, and and you still operate a business now and coach others. But as a business owner taking lessons in empathy, what are they hoping to achieve? What are the business benefits? Is it I guess how can we equate this to ROI?
Yeah, gosh, I could just talk about it all day. There's very few positive business indicators that don't change when there's high levels of empathy. If you go back to what I was saying earlier about fight or flight and the way that the brain works, right? When you feel that your boss gets you, that's kind of a really simple way of understanding empathy. Do they get me? When you say, oh, he really gets me, fundamentally you're saying he empathizes, he understands me, he sees where I'm coming from, he's interested in my opinion, right? Your entire body is at peace. Your brain, your fight or flight is off, right? In that capacity, you are able to perform at full potential. Your brain is working in full. If you've ever had an argument, Matt, and later on you go, why did I say that? Why did I say that? Right? The reason you said that is because your brain was in a state of panic. You actually couldn't control your thinking in that time because, as I said earlier, the blood has gone, right? So when you bring that back to the workplace, you're going to see higher levels of productivity, higher levels of output per capita, higher levels of motivation, engagement, lower levels of absenteeism, lower levels of presenteeism, higher levels of loyalty. The list goes on. There are no business indicators that don't improve across categories, across countries, that when there's higher levels of understanding, there's higher levels of motivation. People work longer hours out of choice. In fact, 73% of people say, if I have an empathetic boss, I will work longer hours out of choice. I want to do better for that person.
And give me some specific business examples here, of situations where empathy's come into play either positively or negatively. Because I'm trying to think of conversations and my, let's say, putting my on the back foot negative attitude towards situations which let's say on paper require empathy normally revolve around what I would say is employees asking for unrealistic or unfair things. So, like a big thing of mine's work from home.
Yeah.
And I fucking hate it. Absolutely hate it. And for me, I'm not moving goalposts. I'll tell you from the outset, I absolutely don't want it. And if that's for you, then I'm not the place. Now, obviously, if you have a one-off family issue, if a dishwasher needs delivering, any of those things, sure. I'm also a very normal and reasonable person, and and I would say that's probably empathetic to listen. Hey, can I have can I work from home this morning, or can I take a day off and make it up elsewhere? But when then someone starts to say, "Oh well, it's gonna suit me better to work from home because then I don't have to pay for taxis to come into work and blah blah blah." For me, that's crossed the line of empathy. I guess it cuts both ways. I could be empathetic to you, but you need to be empathetic to me.
Absolutely.
And I set my stall out from the outset, and you're now trying to change the goalpost. So, that's my probably initial thought of a workplace empathy type situation. But just for the guys listening, and for me, just give me some specific real life examples of things where empathy's come into play positively or negatively.
So first, I want to say to you that I really agree with your point that empathy has to go up as well as down. It's a really good point, because often in my audiences, people think that I'm saying to them, all of you must empathize down in your organization to the Gen Zs and the people below you, right? Which is true. It's great. You should. But we also have to empathize up with our bosses. So to your story there, to the person saying, but Matt, I really now want to work from home. And you're saying, but that is not the business that I run. That is not the culture that I have created here. That empathy also has to go up. So empathy goes up and down and laterally. It is for everyone. This is not a skill set that's just created for us to understand Gen Z, which is what people often tell me, right? But in terms of, I can tell you a couple of stories, but I'll tell you the first one that really comes to mind listening to you, which is from a software business in Mumbai that I was working with recently. And the CEO reached out, and like so many CEOs, struggling with attrition. In fact, globally now, the data shows that 55% of us are planning to resign in the next 6 months, right? So attrition is the biggest issue, hands down, that I work with everywhere in the Middle East and Asia, regardless of country. People can't keep their people, probably for the reasons you're touching on then, right? Mismatch of expectations, which, by the way, is where disappointment comes in, right? The gap between expectation and reality is disappointment. And that's why we're seeing so many people not be able to communicate through those things. But so this gentleman came to me and he said, listen, I really want to understand why my staff are leaving. They're all very young, 25 to 30. I pay them more, but it's not changing anything, Mimi. So the first thing I asked him, I said, well, Sanjay, have you asked them? And he said, well, I can't because they've all left. I said, okay, well then have you asked the people that have stayed behind, why are your friends, your colleagues leaving? And he said, well, no. So I said, okay, well then, let's start there. And that's always the place that I start with these conversations. And you'll be amazed how many HR teams and leaders haven't actually stepped in to fill the gap of that disconnect between what you want as a leader and what they want as a team or how they see it. So I left them to do that in Mumbai. And then probably 2 months later, Sanjay calls me. He says, Mimi, I've got great news. I think we've turned it around. People have stopped resigning. I said, well, Sanjay, that's fantastic. But what did you do? And he said, well, we changed the coffee machine. And I was like, you changed the coffee machine? Yeah, we changed the coffee machine. So turns out that he did get his young men, generally men in that team, together. And he had a discussion. And what he learned, the empathy here, is that in Mumbai at the moment, for all the Indians listening, chai, not cool. Tea is just not cool. Like that's what, mom and auntie drinks. The young people, they want to drink coffee. And more so, they want coffee in a takeaway cup. They want to hold it, whatever their brand of choice is, whether it's, a Starbucks, whatever it is in their city. But the reality of takeaway coffee is it adds up, right, really quickly. I never, ever count my Kareem bill on takeaways, right? Disaster. You want a new job by the time you've counted it. So they actually can't afford to have this sort of status symbol, but they love to. Now, again, for anyone listening who's either lived in India or worked in India or anywhere in South Asia, there are these very old-fashioned Nescafe machines. We used to have a similar one in the UK, right?
I remember them.
You remember them, right?
I
With
do.
The little round buttons.
Yeah.
This office had that Nescafe machine. That's not cool. Nobody wants to drink Nescafe, right? So he got this feedback from the team, and really it was that simple. He took away the Nescafe team and put in a like a Nespresso, a version of Nespresso, and he got fresh milk delivered rather than that long life carton milk. And then he printed cups with their brand name on it. And so now these young guys, they can go in the morning, they can make really good coffee in a really good cup. They can go down to the street and have a chat or whatever they want to do in their break. And they have what they see as kind of a status symbol. It's pretty cool. They feel good about it. But the most important thing from that is they now feel like, our boss is pretty cool. He gets it. Now, when I told this story to one of the UAE's biggest banks this morning, just literally like 2 hours ago, a lady put her hand up and she wanted to say, I just want to tell you, Mimi, this is not just about Gen Zs. Because my best friend is a gentleman in his 40s and he's just moved to Canada. And I spoke to him at the weekend and I said, how's the new job? And the first thing he told me was, you've got amazing coffee, right? So that would be my example here of empathy, Matt. And I think the reference you gave is the one that I always get. Is it, Mimi, is it about giving them more time off or letting them work from home or flexi hours or all those issues that are at hand at the moment? And of course, there is space to understand each other better in those things. But really what we're talking about when we're talking about empathy at work is understanding the drivers, the motivators, and the way that we can turn around this disengagement app. Because we have now, according to Gallup, only 23% of the global working population is engaged, which means 75% of your team, listeners, is disengaged, right? And the cost of that to our global economy, hold on to your seat, is $8.8 trillion, equal to $10.4 billion in the UAE last year in lost productivity because people are either suffering with presenteeism, just turning up, going home, or active disengagement. So that empathy is about how do we fill the gaps and reconnect our teams and engage them in the places that they're working.
So as a business owner, listening to those frightening stats,
They are a bit big.
yeah, I mean, what is a 3-point, 5-point, 10-point, whatever action plan that every business owner should be doing tomorrow to start eating into that 75% problem?
The first thing is that they have to find ways to ensure that people feel that they are listening to them, right? So you'll hear a lot of people talking about psychological safety because it's a hugely relevant point in this. We need cultures where people feel able to speak up, to share their opinions. So for anyone who doesn't really know what psychological safety is, it's fundamentally the ability to speak without fear of a negative response, right? Whether that's sharing an idea or a new innovation, or it could be a complaint or a criticism, right? It doesn't have to be. It could be a positive thing. We need to create environments where people, all ages, not just the young ones, feel able to communicate. And when they do that, they trust that you're going to listen to them, right? That there's a feedback loop here. There's a conversation to be had. So we have to create those cultural environments where that is able and open. You'll find many HR teams having kind of engagement surveys or open forum discussions, various different interventions to enable that dialogue, because there is a huge difference between dialogue and debate or discussion, right? That open communication in the workplace and enabling people to feel that they can really make a difference, they can be heard. Not everybody wants to be a star. Not everybody wants to be a promoted leading person in a business, right? But according to data, 93% of people do want to grow. People want to do well. When you take a toddler to a birthday party and they lose the race or the game, what do? They cry. We don't want to lose. We want to win. People want to perform. But we also have to create environments where they feel able to do so.
So you mentioned toddlers. I mean, how does this apply as well to home life? You know, as a parent, as a husband, as a father, wife, brother, sister. I mean, is this a communication problem? In all aspects of our life.
It is, and I always said I'll never teach children. I am a mum. I have a little girl.
How's your little girl?
She's 6. And I always said I won't teach. I'm not a teacher. I don't want to say the wrong thing to other people's children. But what I realized in this journey, to your point, is that if we don't actually actively try and change this in the school system and teach our children to listen better and empathize better, we're not filling the gaps of the future. Now, the amazing thing, Matt, is that children, and I do work in communities in extremely, extremely poor African communities where there's no education, there's often no caregiving for these children. When you ask them what empathy is, and maybe you don't use the word empathy because they might not understand that specific word, they know intuitively exactly what it is, right? Children, and I'm talking about kind of under 8s, instinctively know how to listen and how to hear each other, but we lose it. So often in our home lives, in parenting, again, back to high stress and low time, we're not listening to our children enough. And that's a really hard thing to shift. And I'll tell you another story. It happened a few weeks ago. I spoke to a very big audience, and at the end, a gentleman from the Gulf came up to me and he said, Mimi, I think I've done a really bad thing. And I was quite taken aback by that in a conference. He said, okay, tell me what's been going on. And he said, well, my son came home yesterday and he had really bad grades. And I shouted at him. And I think I really hurt him. And listening to you today, I realise that I never asked him why. I never listened to why he might have got bad grades. And now, Mimi, I want to leave this conference. And he did. And take him out of school, he's a teenager, and take him out. And first of all, say sorry, but second of all, listen to him. And then 24 hours later, this gentleman messaged me and said, I want to tell you, Mimi, that I did do that. I took my child out for dinner. And I think you may have changed my family forever because we realised we haven't been listening to each other for many years. And often when I tell similar stories to that, there'll be at least a quarter of the audience that will put their hand up or engage and say, I think that's true, Mimi. I don't think I've been listening either. Because life is fast, especially in Dubai, as we touched on at the beginning. Everybody's rushing for the next thing. To be able to hear each other, to be able to really listen, we have to slow down. And that works with toddlers and teenagers and everybody in between. When you listen more, people will tell you more.
What if you start to listen and realise you don't like what you're listening to?
Well, that comes back to judgment. Empathy is agreementless and judgmentless. Okay, so you are listening to understand. You don't have to agree. You don't have to like it. You just have to understand it. And probably the hardest question I ever got asked was by the Metropolitan Police Service in London. And I was working with the counter-terrorism unit. And in hindsight, Matt, I probably should have planned for this question, but I didn't. They asked me in the Q&A, but Mimi, can we empathise with a terrorist who's just blown up London Bridge? And for a second, it really threw me because that is a really big question. But of course, the answer is yes. You don't have to agree, and of course, most of us wouldn't. You definitely don't have to like it, because most of us won't. But if you track back that person's story and journey to how they got to that moment when they showed the behaviour that they did, can you understand it? Yeah. You can understand how somebody got to that environment and made the decisions they do. So listening to someone has actually very little to do with liking what you're hearing, and far more about understanding where they're coming from.
And what are the skills or what are the tactics of being a good listener, other than, I guess, listening and blocking out distractions?
Your point there is really valid. So the first thing in the world that we live in is getting rid of your cell phone for a little while. You know, there's research that shows, and I don't have mine near me, but if I did, I would show you it on our cameras. If I took my phone out right now and just put it on the table, I didn't look at it, I didn't touch it, but it's there, the research will show that the quality of the engagement decreases, because your brain is automatically going to think, why should she put her phone? Is she looking at it? Is she not interested in me? Does she want to get out of this podcast, right? So yes, limiting distractions is a really important one. Eye contact, we just are very unpracticed at this, and that is partly due to tech, because we've got our phone in our hands most of the time. And the best way I can tell you and your listeners to practice your eye contact is to try and notice, I've just done it with you, try and notice the colour of someone's eyes. Yeah, there we go. Not that obviously, because people are going to be like, who is this guy looking at me like in the marina? But yes, if you try and notice the colour of someone's eyes, it will take a couple of seconds. And in that couple of seconds, the other person won't notice, because you're not going to do it like that. You create connection. And eye contact, again, it impacts the subconscious. So it creates a different chemical reaction in the body. So eye contact's really, really important. If you have children, small children specifically, get down to that eye level, particularly if you really want a young child to tell me why you did that. If they've been naughty or they've done something, come down so that you can see them eye to eye and the quality of the information goes up. So eye contact's really important. Body language is really important. Leaning into the conversation, not crossing your arms. Crossing your arms is... oh God, it just feels so awkward to me. But crossing your arms is actually, again, from a evolutionary point of view, the reason as humans we started crossing our arms was to protect ourselves, again, from danger. So the reason we cross our arms in front of our lungs and our heart is not by accident, right? You are blocking the most important organs of the body to protect life. So subconsciously, we still know that. So when you cross your arms in front of someone, subconsciously, you are showing them danger. You are creating fear. It's very small, but it creates distance. Of course, the way we understand that modern world is, oh, he's a bit bored, or he doesn't really like what I'm saying. But fundamentally, that's where that's coming from an evolutionary point of view. So keeping your body language open, keeping your eyes in connection with people, and then the way you speak. So I touched earlier on neurolinguistics and just the way you ask questions. The tip I'd give everybody listening is to shift from the word why to the word how. This is the most amazing, easy thing to do, right? When you say why to someone, and why is a good word, right? It's a curious word. So when you're talking about empathy, you're looking to be curious. But why is an attacking word, right? Because you're really asking why, right? If you shift that to how, unbelievable things happen. So let's do it in the home. If your teenager comes home late from the mall and you say, why are you late? Immediately they're on the defensive. Probably they knew you were going to say it as well, right? But the minute you shift that to how, so can you tell me how it is? that you're late? Can you tell me how it is that we've come to Tuesday night and you are late again, right? Same in the workplace. Like, why did you miss that deadline versus can you help me understand how we missed that deadline? It's unbelievable the impact on the brain and then the communication that comes from that. So I teach it to many managers and leaders in the workplace. Shift your whys to how. And you will see whole different levels of communication, whole different levels of listening. With that, any other form of question that encourages understanding. So can you tell me how you got to that? Can you help me understand why you want to do that? Can you help me understand, what it is that's happening in the team that you're uncomfortable with, right? So any form of open-ending question helps us listen more. And the last thing I'd say is to be really comfortable with pausing, with silence. The Japanese do it beautifully because they believe in this. If you give people 3 to 5 seconds at the end of their sentence, they will often carry on. And in that carrying on, they will often give you far more insight than they ever would have in the first piece of information they shared. But you have to really be conscious of that because in the first few times it feels a bit uncomfortable. Just give people space. And they'll often go, oh, and I just want to add, right? So that power of a pause is magical.
And when you're teaching this to big organisations, are you only teaching, let's say, from a management level, taking empathy down, or does everybody get involved in these learnings so that I guess the people who are needed to be listened to understand more about the concept and the process as well?
Yeah, both. We do it both. I've recently completed some training in Asia for bank managers and the level below the bank manager in branches. So these are service customer facing people who are using that empathy not just with each other, but we're talking about how do they use it with their customers, right? How do you empathize? One of the examples in this Sri Lankan bank recently that they asked me is we had promised a loan to a customer. And for anyone that knows Asian culture, they know that weddings are very important, particularly for daughters. And this gentleman had been promised a loan that would come in time for his daughter's wedding. And the bank couldn't deliver on it in the end, paperwork reasons, and perhaps it was even the customer's misjudgment. Maybe he hadn't given them all the information they needed or something. But he came into the bank, screaming like a mad person because the wedding's, now in 2 weeks and he can't afford to pay for it. And this is his daughter, right? This is a little girl. So we were, using a lot of role modeling around how do you use empathy for that person. And now a lot of my work is in conflict management. How do you use understanding at a service level, on the front line? Somebody asked me this week, can you teach it to people that work on oil rigs? Yes. All the way up to the top.
But using that situation or that example of the guy with the loan, I mean, do you also teach solutions in these situations as well? Because I mean, putting yourself in the shoes of that guy, I mean, you can use all the empathy tactics in the world to relate to him, to this, that, and the other. At the end of the day, if he doesn't get yes, you might calm him down for a minute, but he's going to rile up pretty quickly again if he's still not getting that money.
Yeah, look, in the end, when there's a challenge like that, and this is what I said to the guys at the time, in this situation, they could not fix it. That loan was not coming. That wedding was not going to happen as he had hoped it would. That reality was unfortunately set in stone. They had missed whatever deadline they needed for that money to come through in that system. So the empathy is not going to fix the problem. It's not going to turn around the problem. It's not supposed to. Fundamentally, what the empathy is going to do, that engagement, that connection, is going to facilitate them overcoming that problem and it perhaps not elevating to other levels of stress, right? So one of the organizations that teaches empathy the most is actually the FBI. And they use empathy in hostage negotiations, so in the toughest of environments. The US Army as well is the second. So really big organizations using this in really even tougher environments than cancelled weddings. And the FBI have a model called the Behavioral Change Stairway, and is a 5-step model to how they help overcome any hostage situation. So if you've ever watched a movie where there's a guy holding up a bank and he's got everybody inside, and you'll see like all of the NYPD, the cops, right? All the police are outside shouting in their microphones and their megaphones and all that stuff, right? And then the FBI guy will come and the first thing he will do is push them all away and say, just stop talking to that person, go away, right? And he moves them back. And then he'll call that guy with the gun in the bank. And the first thing he will do is listen. The first step of the behavioural change stairway is to listen to them and say, okay, tell me, how's your day? What's happened here? What's going on? Why are you here? So the first step is to listen. Again, same with the guy with the wedding. The second step is to build rapport, to start showing him that you're understanding that. And the third is empathy. The fourth and the fifth move into behavioural change. So impact and then behavioural change. But what the FBI is teaching us is that if you want any level of behavioural change, if you want to overcome any level of conflict and bring that down, listening is a path to do that. So you're not going to uncancel the wedding, for sure. But what you might do is change the environment where that conversation is going on. Perhaps stop him shouting. Perhaps stop him leaving the bank and becoming an ex-customer. Perhaps stop him going out into the family and telling everybody he knows to also leave the bank, right? Managing down that situation. So it's about communication versus actual kind of output change, I think.
Do you see many cultural differences in empathy? I mean, you talk all around the world, and we talk a lot about Asia in some of these recent examples. But I mean, do you see big empathy deficit problems? Depending whether it's Eastern and Western.
You see, so it's a really great question, and I get asked similar questions often. We don't have enough data to really map the world in empathy yet. However, what we do see is the difference between collectivist and individualistic societies. So collectivist societies, which is the majority of Asia, a lot of the Middle East, and some of Africa, versus individualistic cultures and realities, which tends to be in the West. Also called high context versus low context environments, right? So somewhere like the UK and America, Europe and America, is very low context. 90% of what people say is what they mean, right? You go into a meeting with Americans, before they've even said good morning, they've told you what they want and how they're going to get there, right? The opposite in the Asian world, for example, you have something called high context cultures, which is where actually 90% of what you do is only 10% of what you mean, right? So if you sit in a meeting in India, for example, you're going to go through like a 2-hour meeting and you might still never get to actually what people really want to tell you. They might tell you that later in the evening over a drink or a cup of tea, right? So the difference in cultural context and how people engage definitely changes the levels of empathy. Highly individualistic societies have lower levels of natural empathy. In cities like Oslo, Tokyo, Chicago, because there was a recent study, up to 48% of homes are one singular lone person. I suspect it's quite high in Dubai as well. People living all alone, right? In collectivist societies like Malaysia, where I live, you see many more multi-generational homes. Same here within the Gulf families here in the UAE. You'll see 3 or sometimes 4 generations in the home. So lots of multi-generational living. You'll see people sharing communities, eating in communities. In Malaysia, often people will come downstairs in their apartment buildings and they'll eat in like a food court downstairs. Many groups together, it's very social. In those collectivist societies, natural empathy is higher because they are constantly surrounded by their communities and understanding and talking and gossiping and driving up that empathy. So yes, there are definitely different levels, but it's not got a sort of official global scale, as it were.
What's your backstory? I mean, how did you, did you always know all this about empathy? Have you had to go and learn it? Have you, I guess, experienced it in your own businesses?
Yeah. I never knew I had it, actually. I think to answer that, people often ask me, is empathy something, is it nature or nurture? And I think today, the answer is both. I think whilst we all have it, we're all born with it, you have to be nurtured or taught or encouraged to use it.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, go on.
You're born with it. Do you lose it or are you just not using it?
You're just not using it. Yeah, like any skill set. It's like even a bit like, I don't know, even driving a car, right? If you stop driving for a few years and then you get a rental, you're like, oh, all right. It's the same thing. It doesn't go anywhere. You just get out of practice. But so I think I always had high levels of empathy, but I never knew it. And actually, Matt, my life kind of changed in 2018 when I met with a business coach here in Dubai, actually. And I had taken a role in Dubai, a CEO role. I had moved here from across the world. And when I took the job, the business was, if we're going to be very politically correct in a recording, less than I expected. Not quite as I expected, shall we say. The business wasn't as healthy as perhaps I had been led to believe.
You're so much more polite than my other guests.
I'm quintessentially British over here. So this business was not in a great way, and I went to see a business coach to help me kind of unpack how I was going to turn this business around. And she asked me this question that changed my life. She asked me about my leadership style, and I told her that I had been using intuition and that I was a very intuitive leader. And she stopped me and she said, Mimi, is it intuition or is it empathy? And that question changed my life. At the time, by the way, I didn't think it was empathy. So I was like, no, it's not empathy. But it led me to discover this space. And I then went away and started researching it. I discovered lots of the data we touched on at the beginning. I discovered the empathy deficit, the fact that we're losing 38% of our empathy over the last 30 odd years. The empathy deficit was coined by Barack Obama 20 years ago. We've done very little with it since then, but I discovered all of this. And then I just felt I had to write about it, partly, honestly, in kind of like self-therapy. It was very therapeutic for me just to write down what I was learning about this and how I might use it to turn this business around. And before I knew it, I had about 30,000 words written predominantly on Emirates aeroplanes. And someone suggested I write a book. And I was never planning on being an author. And I remember it so clearly. And she said, well, why don't you write a book? And I remember saying to her, surely the only people that write books is like John Grisham and somebody at Harvard, like not me. But I did. And
you weren't a speaker or a coach or anything at this point. No, you were still operating your own business. This was just a side accident.
Yeah, I'm an accidental entrepreneur. I really, and even this work today, this was never meant to make me any money. It was just passion. I wrote the book and then it became a bestseller. And then I had this podcast and nearly 100,000 people came. And before I knew it, this world became of me. I don't know, purpose is just the most overused word in the world. But I think it was my purpose. I think this is what I was always meant to do. And because of that, it's very easy for me to do it. I work very long hours. I travel all the time. And I just love it. I just love what I do.
And is working for you primarily talking about this and teaching this, or I think you have a branding agency as well. You still operate your own business?
Yeah, I do. We have a phenomenal branding agency called A Life by Design. It's headquartered in Singapore, actually. We have an office here in Dubai, and we do lots of work in branding in the real estate sector. Okay. So that takes up some of my time. And the rest of the time I'm speaking, I'm doing masterclasses and workshops and helping people listen.
Do you find, does empathy feature in branding in any way?
It does. I mean, when I think back to how I started my career in advertising, which is the role I did for a very long time, we used to do a lot of what we called focus groups back then, consumer understanding, consumer insight work. And fundamentally all of that and all of kind of design thinking comes back to empathy, right? Being able to understand customers or clients or people that you're trying to sell to. So yeah, absolutely. In the world of marketing and branding, there is a huge role for understanding other people. If not your audience, then your client. And we've had a really great run of winning business here in the UAE. And normally the feedback is, and I know that our work, by the way, is not the best in the world. I mean, there's many brilliant branding agencies. Our work is good, but it's not the best in the world. But we win because we listen. And the clients in some way always tell me that. Mimi, you were the only people that really heard what I wanted. You really got it. And what they're saying is you listened, right? Compared to many other businesses perhaps that listened, I don't know, less well maybe.
Are you a Gary Vee listener?
No, not anymore. But I know who he is.
Why not anymore? Well,
I don't know.
Did something happen?
Nothing happened with me and Gary Vee. No, I just...
The reason I ask
it's not in my circle anymore.
It's not a random question. It's because the first time I'd actually heard the word empathy was from him.
He has a wine brand called
Empathy Wines. He does. That's right.
He does.
And I think he's one of his books. It's like 13 something or others. Emotional skills or whatever that you need to learn. One of them is about empathy. But in terms of the things he talks about, obviously he's got 3 or 4 key pillars he talks about. Obviously, particularly branding on social media. But I guess hence the name Empathy Wines. I mean, he hammers on about empathy and how he feels that is his biggest quality, one of his biggest skills as a leader. But like I said, I'd never even heard the word before him, to be honest. So.
Yeah. No, I haven't heard him talk about it, but I did know that he had empathy wines. But perhaps that says more about my love for wines.
I mean, if you listen to any of his content anymore, I mean, you don't need to listen to many episodes before he starts to talk about it. I mean, it is literally the word is every fifth word on the end of his tongue.
I should send him a message. I should send him my book and say, let's talk.
And talk about the book. I mean, what else is in the book that that we haven't been talking about today? What can people expect to find in there or learn?
Well, that book that you're talking about is my first book. It came out here. It was published here in the UAE in 2020. So it's a couple of years old now. It is fundamentally the story of this leadership journey of turning around that business. And we did. It became a huge success.
This tells the story of that business. Okay.
It does. It tells the story of how we did it. It has lots of steps in there and learnings in there, what we did to the environment, all kinds of things.
Give us a spoiler other than empathy. How did you turn it around?
A spoiler. One of the things in there is we talk about the scent that we used in the office to create a more engaging environment. Okay. So we talk about scent. We talk about coffee machines. We talk about seating. All kinds of different things that we did in the small space that we had to create more understanding, more engagement, just a happier team, and turn it around. But probably, I guess, more interesting is my new book, because it's coming out in October. It's been a couple of years since I wrote that one. And the new book covers a lot of the data that I've spoke to you about today. In fact, I've probably shared more with you than I have anywhere else yet.
I hope so.
There we go. So the new book is about longevity and the connection to empathy. So some of that data I said at the beginning about you could be the healthiest person in the world, but if you have no connection, you're statistically likely to die 8 years earlier. So the book is in 3 parts. It looks at longevity and leadership. So why is it that listening and listening-led leadership is going to get you promoted, number one, but help you have a longer career, more success in your career? The second part is around relationships. So I often wonder, how many marriages could we save if we were able to listen to each other better? There's also some content in there for mother-in-laws, for anyone who needs to listen better at home. And then the last part is about health. So it is unpacking that health data around, we're all looking for the secret to longevity and how we live longer, healthier lives. And we have some phenomenal data in there from Harvard, also from the Blue Zones. If anyone's, I don't know, have you seen it? Have you seen the Blue Zone documentary on Netflix?
No.
You've got to do that before you come to KL, and we're going to unpack it over a cold drink. But for anyone listening, it's a phenomenal documentary, 5 parts, I think I'm right in saying, on Netflix, came out about a month and a half ago. And the Blue Zones is a piece of research where they looked at all of the parts of the world where they have a high percentage of centenarians, so people that live to 100 and beyond. And they studied, there's 5 of them, they studied these areas, and then they looked at what brought them together. What is it that connects the areas of the world where people live the longest, and what can we learn? So it's a really great Netflix series. And we use a lot of that data in the book as well, and look at what is it about these remote parts of, there's a place in Japan, place in Italy, place in Greece, place in Latin America, that connects those societies. And why is that making them live longer? And how can we all learn from that? So,
and tell me, with the living longer and the loneliness issue, I mean, if you are, let's say, a person wanting to learn about empathy so that you can be kinder to others and help other people live longer, get that bit. What if you're the lonely person? Can they learn from this, or is it for them? Do they just have to go out and knock on doors and say, "Hey, I'm lonely. Do you want to talk to me?"
Shame. No, it's definitely. Empathy is for everyone, really. What we didn't talk much about today is self-empathy, which is another large part of my work, which is empathizing with yourself, right? The ability to understand yourself and understand what you
not being too hard on yourself. Or...
Not being too hard on yourself, speaking to yourself as you would your best friend, really. So often if you think about when your best friend or somebody close to you has had a bad time or an issue, and the way you speak to that person, and then take a moment to think about last time you made a mistake and what you said to yourself, I would, guess that the gap is quite big. When someone else does it, you tell them, don't worry, it wasn't your fault, it was an accident, you didn't mean to, it's going to be fine. When it's yourself, you're like, why are you so stupid? I can't believe you did that. Why would you do, all of those things, right? So,
I think, the way most people speak to themselves, if you spoke to other people the way you spoke to yourself, you wouldn't have any mates.
You would have no friends, exactly. So we're extremely harsh on ourselves, right? But we're also very disconnected to ourselves. So Self-empathy is that ability to really connect back to yourself and know what you need to connect, to thrive, to be better at work, in life, wherever it is. And actually, self-empathy is the first step really to all empathy. Because if you don't understand yourself, it's very hard to understand others without judgment, because you're going to carry your own judgments and your own realities into those environments. So back to your question about what can lonely people do, I think the first thing is to work out what is it that's causing your loneliness and how might you find solutions to that. So whether it's joining new hobbies or groups, that doesn't have to be in real life, it can be online. Finding people that are like-minded, maybe they share a love for the same pet you have or some form of travel. The one thing that I say to all people in this position is the only person that can fix your loneliness is you. You have to act. You can't sit at home with what many people would sort of explain as a victim mentality or feeling sorry for yourself, right? You are alone. You are feeling lonely. You can change it, so you have to go out and find those connections. I'm not saying it's easy. I've been lonely. I know what it's like. It's not easy, but you can turn it around.
Well, Mimi, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here.
Thank you.
We've got the book. We know about you speaking, but give yourself a little shout out for where people can find you and contact you and learn more.
People can find me at Mimi Nicklin, anywhere, basically, on all platforms. I'm most active on Instagram and on LinkedIn. And my website is www.empathyeverywhere.co.
Perfect. Well, listen, I'm going to look forward to reading this book. I'm going to look forward to seeing the next one as well. And hopefully I will see you in KL at some time in the future.
You definitely will. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.